The carriage wound slowly up the steep, broken mountain road, each turn scraping Clara's nerves raw. She sat motionless on the hard bench, her hands wrapped tightly around a small, worn journal pressed to her chest. The cover was frayed, the corners softened by years of handling. It had belonged to her sister, now gone. Outside the narrow window, towering pines leaned over the road, their dark needles catching the early morning mist. The forest seemed to press closer with each bend, as if trying to swallow the path completely. Clara's stomach twisted with each shuddering jolt of the wheels. At last, the carriage emerged onto a narrow plateau. Before her rose a villa, its tall gray walls streaked with age and moss, a single tower piercing the sky like a needle. Ivy crept up the stones, strangling the lower windows. The roof sloped steeply, heavy with dark slate, giving the whole structure a hunched, watchful shape. The driver, an old man with a face as cracked as the road, did not speak when he opened the door. Clara stepped down carefully, her boots sinking into the damp gravel. A sharp wind swept up from the forest below, pulling at her hair and cutting through her thin dress. At the top of the steps stood Mrs. Elsner. Her black gown fell in rigid, perfect folds, as though it were carved from shadow itself. Her face was sharp and pale, framed by hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. In her gloved hands, she held a single cane, more ornamental than practical, tipped with a polished silver head in the shape of a raven. Clara lowered her eyes immediately, clutching the journal tighter against her ribs. "Clara," Mrs. Elsner called, her voice soft but impossibly cold. "Come." Clara obeyed, climbing the steps with careful, hesitant steps. Up close, Mrs. Elsner's eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, and they moved over Clara's face as if weighing each fragile thought inside her skull. "You are here to serve as my companion," Mrs. Elsner said. "I expect obedience, silence when required, and no questions about this place or those who came before you." Clara nodded, her throat too tight to form a reply. Mrs. Elsner turned sharply, her gown whispering like dry leaves against the stone floor. Clara followed her through the heavy oak doors into a dim foyer. The air inside was cold and faintly scented with old candles and damp stone. Faded portraits lined the walls, their subjects' faces lost in deep shadows. Clara's eyes flicked over them quickly, then dropped to the marble tiles underfoot. Mrs. Elsner led her to a narrow staircase that curled upward into the villa's spine. At the first landing, she gestured to a small wooden door. "This is your room," she said. "Meals are taken at the second bell. You will assist me with reading in the afternoons. You will remain inside after dusk. You will not enter the tower. You will not ask why." Clara nodded again, her fingers digging into the journal so hard she felt the spine crack beneath her grip. Mrs. Elsner studied her a moment longer, then turned and descended the stairs without another word. Clara stepped into her room. The space was narrow, barely wider than her outstretched arms. A small bed with a gray blanket sat beneath a barred window that looked out into the endless forest. A single chair stood beside an empty wash basin. She closed the door softly behind her and leaned against it, her legs trembling. She opened the journal slowly, her sister's neat handwriting greeting her like a long-lost voice. Clara traced the ink with her fingertips, breathing slowly until her heartbeat softened in her chest. Outside, a low roll of thunder echoed through the mountains, and the villa seemed to shudder in reply. She was here now. Whatever bargain had been made, whatever silence demanded of her, she was already inside the cage. Morning arrived in a pale, lifeless glow that barely pushed through the barred window. Clara sat upright on the narrow bed, the journal still open across her knees. Her fingers hovered over her sister's careful script, tracing words she had read so many times they felt carved into her skin. A sudden sharp knock cracked against her door. Clara flinched, snapping the journal shut. Before she could rise, the door swung open. Mrs. Elsner stood in the doorway, her silhouette long and rigid in her black gown. The silver raven head of her cane glinted faintly in the gray light. "Up!" she commanded. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken threats. Clara obeyed, her legs trembling slightly as she stood. She held the journal tight against her chest, but Mrs. Elsner's eyes flicked to it and then away, as if dismissing something trivial. "You will listen carefully," Mrs. Elsner began, stepping fully into the room. The cold air seemed to follow her, sinking into Clara's bones. "There are rules in this house," she continued. "You will rise before the first bell. You will assist me in the library each afternoon, read aloud when asked, and keep records of my correspondence. You will take your meals in silence. You will not leave your room after dusk." Clara nodded once, her throat tight. "You will not enter the tower," Mrs. Elsner added, her eyes narrowing slightly. "There are matters there beyond your place, beyond your understanding." A pause. Clara felt her heartbeat flutter against her ribs as though it might fly out of her chest. "You will not ask about the companions who came before you," Mrs. Elsner finished. Her voice fell even softer now, the words almost a whisper. "Their stories are not yours to carry." Clara lowered her gaze, her fingers digging into the journal's spine. She felt each word sink into her like icy needles. Mrs. Elsner stepped closer, the tip of her cane clicking lightly on the stone floor. She lifted a gloved hand and with surprising gentleness tilted Clara's chin upward. Their eyes met, pale gray swallowing brown. "Obedience will keep you safe," Mrs. Elsner murmured. She released Clara's chin and turned sharply, her gown whispering around her legs as she moved. At the door she paused. "You will bring that journal to the library this afternoon," she said, her voice once again flat and commanding. Then she left, shutting the door behind her with a soft but final thud. Clara sank back onto the bed, her lungs struggling to fill. She opened the journal again, but her sister's words blurred beneath a thin sheen of tears. In the sudden hush, she realized the house itself seemed to breathe around her, slow, deliberate listening. Clara pressed her forehead to the cool paper, trying to steady her thoughts. But deep inside, she felt something coiling tight, a quiet terror laced with the first flickers of something else, something sharper than fear. The day unfolded in a heavy, smothering silence. Clara moved through the villa's halls with her head lowered, the journal clutched to her side as if it might dissolve without her grip. In the kitchen, she first saw the housekeeper, a thin, severe woman with deep lines around her mouth and eyes that seemed to look through everything and everyone. She moved like a shadow, her hands quick and precise as she chopped roots and wiped down the cold stone counters. She did not speak. When Clara entered, the housekeeper's eyes flickered up for only an instant before returning to her work. Further beyond the kitchen, through a narrow back corridor, Clara glimpsed the groundskeeper in the courtyard. He stood with his back to her, tending to a row of stunted bushes that clawed up the villa's walls. His shoulders were broad, but seemed to sag under an invisible weight. When he turned slightly, Clara saw his face, pale, hollow-eyed, his lips pressed into a hard line. A thin scar curved from his ear down to his jaw, disappearing beneath his collar. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. Something sharp and desperate flashed across his expression before he jerked his head down and turned away, almost as if he had been caught committing a crime. Clara wanted to speak, to ask him anything, but her throat closed around the words. Instead, she slipped past, her steps barely brushing the cold floor. In the afternoons, Clara joined Mrs. Elsner in the library, a long, echoing room lined with high shelves that seemed to vanish into darkness above. Dust floated in pale shafts of light from the tall windows, and the air smelled of old paper and dried lavender. Mrs. Elsner sat in a heavy carved chair near the hearth. Her posture was perfectly straight, her gloved hands folded neatly over the raven-headed cane resting across her lap. She listened as Clara read aloud from various letters and books, her pale eyes moving slowly across Clara's face, never blinking for long. At times, Mrs. Elsner would close her eyes and hum softly, a sound that sent chills skittering down Clara's spine. The housekeeper would occasionally enter, her steps nearly soundless. She would set a tray of tea on the table without a word, her thin hands trembling faintly as she placed the cups. Mrs. Elsner never acknowledged her. On the third afternoon, while Clara gathered loose papers on the library table, the housekeeper brushed past her. For a heartbeat, Clara felt a gentle tug on her sleeve, so soft she almost thought she imagined it. When she turned, the housekeeper was already moving away, her face as blank as the cold stone walls. But in that tiny gesture, something unspoken had passed between them, a question or perhaps a warning. That night, Clara sat in her narrow bed, the journal open on her knees. She tried to read her sister's words, but her thoughts kept returning to the groundskeeper's haunted eyes and the housekeeper's trembling hands. It became clear to her then she was not alone in her fear. Others moved through the villa like ghosts, each locked in their own silent struggle. Clara pressed her fingers to the pages, her breath catching in her throat. Outside her barred window, the forest writhed under the moonlight, and deep within her chest, a single dangerous thought began to take shape. Days stretched and blurred in the cold, breathless hush of the villa. Clara moved carefully through each hour, her senses sharpened to every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind clawing at the high windows. Each morning she woke before the bell, her fingers wrapped around the journal as though it might vanish in the night. She dressed quickly, listening for Mrs. Elsner's steps outside her door. The cane tapped sometimes, softly, as if testing the floor for weakness, or for her presence. In the kitchen, the housekeeper drifted between tasks like a wraith. Her face seemed more hollow each day, her hands trembling even as they scrubbed the same spotless counters. The groundskeeper appeared only briefly, passing the kitchen window with his head bent low, his shoulders curled inward as if expecting a blow. Clara watched him whenever she could, her eyes tracking his hesitant movements through the fog-draped courtyard. Once she saw him pause beneath the tower window, looking up. His lips moved, but no sound reached her. Before she could move closer, he turned sharply and disappeared into the garden shadows. At night, Clara listened. She heard Mrs. Elsner's quiet humming echoing through the halls, a thin, lilting sound that rose and fell like a hymn to something no living soul should hear. The notes slipped beneath her door and pooled in the corners of her small room, crawling up her spine until she shivered uncontrollably. Most unsettling of all was the tower door. Each day she passed it on her way to the library, a tall, narrow slab of wood reinforced with dark iron bands. A heavy brass lock gleamed at its center. Sometimes she swore she heard movement behind it, a faint shuffle, a quiet scrape, like someone pacing in a confined space. She once pressed her palm to the cold wood, holding her breath. On the other side, silence pressed back, a silence so thick it felt like a living thing. In the library, Mrs. Elsner often fell into long, heavy silences while Clara read. Her pale eyes drifted shut, her thin lips moving as if echoing some private prayer. Clara's voice would falter, but Mrs. Elsner never corrected her. She only opened her eyes slowly, studying Clara with a strange, hungry patience. One afternoon, as Clara turned to collect a book from the lower shelf, she caught sight of the housekeeper lingering in the doorway. Their eyes met. The housekeeper's gaze was sharp, almost pleading, before she stepped back into the corridor and vanished. That night, Clara could not sleep. She sat at the window, the journal in her lap, watching the fog roll like a restless sea beneath the moonlight. The villa seemed to breathe around her, each corridor and locked door alive with secrets. Clara's heart thudded against her ribs, her mind spinning with fragments of whispers, unfinished glances, and that silent pull toward the tower. Something inside her shifted then. Not courage exactly, but a small, bright defiance that flickered at the edge of her fear. She closed her sister's journal slowly, pressing her forehead to the cover. She knew she would not be able to stay obedient forever. The next afternoon came heavy with a storm-brewing hush. The sky pressed low against the villa roof, gray and swollen, as if the clouds themselves were listening. Clara moved through the library with careful quiet, her eyes tracing the spines of old books, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged papers. Mrs. Elsner sat in her high-backed chair by the fireplace, her eyes half closed, her fingers resting lightly on the raven-headed cane. A sudden gust rattled the windows, and Mrs. Elsner's eyes snapped open. She fixed Clara with a cold, glassy stare. "You may leave me now," she said, her voice as flat as the iron lock on the tower door. "Return to your room and remain there until the evening bell." Clara dipped her head in obedience, tucking her sister's journal under her arm. She backed from the room slowly, her pulse drumming in her throat. In the hallway, she paused. The heavy hush of the house pressed down on her. She turned her head slightly, and there it was, the tower door, tall and dark, its brass lock gleaming like an eye in the half-light. Her feet moved before her mind could stop them. She approached on silent steps, her breath held so tightly her lungs burned. Clara reached out, her fingers brushing the cold iron bands. She could almost feel a pulse beneath the surface, as if the wood itself shivered under her touch. Slowly she bent and pressed her ear to the door. At first, nothing. Then, a faint sound, so soft she nearly missed it. A low rhythmic scrape like nails dragging across stone. A muffled gasp, then silence. A tremor shot through Clara's body. Her hand drifted downward to the brass lock, her thumb testing its edges. "Clara." She jolted back, her heart slamming against her ribs. Mrs. Elsner stood at the end of the hallway, her black gown dissolving into the shadows like smoke. For a moment, neither moved. Mrs. Elsner's eyes gleamed, wide and unblinking, her gloved hands clasping the cane so tightly the raven's head seemed ready to snap. "Come here," Mrs. Elsner said softly, but the softness carried a blade's edge. Clara's legs felt filled with lead as she stepped forward, her head bowed, the journal clutched so tightly her knuckles whitened. When she reached Mrs. Elsner, the older woman lifted one hand and smoothed Clara's hair with a slow, deliberate motion. The touch made Clara's skin crawl. "You are curious," Mrs. Elsner murmured, her voice almost tender. "Curiosity is a disease here. It rots the mind." Clara's eyes burned with tears she dared not let fall. "Tonight," Mrs. Elsner continued, leaning close so her cold breath touched Clara's cheek, "you will stand in your room. You will not eat. You will not drink. You will not sit or lie down until I say." She stepped back, her eyes searching Clara's face for any flicker of rebellion. When none came, she turned and glided down the corridor, her cane tapping softly, a sound like a clock marking the last moments before a sentence. Clara stumbled to her room, the journal pressed to her stomach like a shield. That night, she stood as ordered. Her legs shook, her mouth dried and cracked. Shadows crawled across the walls, growing taller and more twisted with each passing hour. She pressed her forehead to the door, her tears finally sliding down her cheeks. But beneath the exhaustion and pain, a new dangerous certainty began to form. She would not die in this house. The next morning arrived as a dull gray smear across the sky. Clara's legs ached so deeply that even standing felt like knives slicing through her bones. Her eyes were sunken, her lips split from thirst. When the morning bell finally rang, she dropped to her knees on the floor, her body shaking violently. She stayed there for a long moment, pressing her forehead to the cold boards, the journal lying beside her like a quiet witness. Eventually, she forced herself up. Her fingers fumbled with her dress ties, and each movement felt like moving through water. But inside her chest, something sharp had solidified overnight. A decision that burned hotter than her exhaustion. She waited until midday, watching the halls through the thin crack of her door. The housekeeper moved silently between rooms, her shoulders hunched, her eyes flicking constantly toward the shadowy end of the corridor. The groundskeeper slipped past once, his head down, carrying a bundle of dry branches. When Clara heard Mrs. Elsner's cane echoing from the library, far away, she pushed the door open and stepped into the hall. The tower door loomed behind her, but today she turned away from it. Instead, she moved quickly down the narrow back staircase, the journal pressed tightly under her arm. In the kitchen, the housekeeper stood alone, her back to the door. Clara froze. For a heartbeat, their eyes met in the reflection of a tarnished kettle. The housekeeper's hand twitched toward her apron pocket, then fell limp at her side. Clara's pulse roared in her ears. She slipped past the threshold and through the scullery door into the small stone corridor leading to the garden. The air smelled of wet earth and moss, the fog beyond the doorway curling and shifting like a living thing. At the far end, she saw the garden gate, tall and iron-bound, half hidden by tangled hedges. Her feet stumbled across the slippery stones as she ran, her breath tearing through her throat. When she reached the gate, her shaking hands wrapped around the latch. But the metal refused to move. A heavy iron chain wound through the bars, secured with a rusted lock. A shuffling sound behind her. She turned. The groundskeeper stood a few paces away, his single good hand clenched into a fist at his side. His eyes glistened with something between terror and apology. "Please," Clara croaked, her voice cracked and raw. "Please help me." He flinched as if struck. His mouth opened, but no words came. His eyes darted to the ground, then to the villa behind them. Clara's hands clawed at the chain again, pulling until her fingers bled, but the lock held firm. A sharp sound cut through the garden, the crisp, deliberate tap of Mrs. Elsner's cane on the stone path. The groundskeeper took a single step back, then another. He turned and vanished into the fog, his figure swallowed in an instant. Clara staggered away from the gate, stumbling into a patch of wet earth. She fell to her knees, mud seeping into her dress. The journal slipped from her grasp, landing open on the stones, its pages spattered with dirt. Mrs. Elsner appeared at the garden archway, her black gown blending into the fog as if she had stepped out of it. Her pale eyes fixed on Clara, unblinking and endless. Slowly she raised her cane and pointed to the ground in front of Clara. "Crawl," she commanded, her voice smooth and quiet. "Crawl back inside." Clara's arms shook as she obeyed, dragging herself across the stones, her fingernails scraping against the moss. When she reached the doorway, Mrs. Elsner stepped aside and watched her pass, her eyes glittering with dark satisfaction. That evening, Clara was forced to scrub the marble terrace until her hands split open and bled into the soapy water. As the moon rose, she curled in her narrow bed, the journal clutched against her chest once more. Her body throbbed with pain, but somewhere beneath it all, her mind sparked with a dangerous clarity. She would not beg again. The next day unfolded in a haze of pain and cold. Clara's fingers were wrapped in rough cloth strips. Each movement sent shocks of fire up her arms. But she forced herself through the motions, washing, folding, carrying trays. The house demanded constant obedience, and her body performed even as her mind drifted elsewhere. That morning, while cleaning the small linen room near the upper hallway, she found it. A bundle of old sheets had toppled from a shelf, scattering dust and small scraps of fabric across the floor. As she reached to gather them, her hand brushed something stiff and folded. Heart pounding, she pulled it free, an envelope, yellowed and torn at the edges, hidden beneath the linen pile. Her fingers trembled as she slipped out a thin piece of paper covered in faded ink. "She promised me peace when I arrived. She said the tower would heal me. I heard them above me every night, scratching, weeping. She called it a cleansing, but I saw their eyes when they came back down, empty, like dolls left in the rain. I cannot leave. She will not allow it. If anyone finds this, do not trust her kindness. Do not trust her music. The tower is not a sanctuary. It is an altar." Clara's mouth went dry. She read the words again and again, each line searing into her bones. The mention of the tower, the empty eyes. It all confirmed what she had felt creeping along the edges of her mind since she arrived. A sudden creak in the hall snapped her head up. The housekeeper stood at the doorway, her face pale and tight. Her eyes darted to the letter, then to Clara's face. For a heartbeat, neither woman moved. Then, with surprising speed, the housekeeper stepped forward and snatched the letter from Clara's shaking hands. She crumpled it quickly, hiding it beneath her apron. Clara reached out instinctively. "Please," she whispered. The housekeeper's eyes met hers, and in them Clara saw a flash of raw terror, deeper and older than anything she had ever seen. The housekeeper shook her head, so small and sharp it felt like a blade. Then she turned and fled the room, her steps silent as falling ash. Clara sank to the floor, her breath coming in ragged pulls. She pressed her bandaged hands to her temples, feeling her skull throb beneath her fingers. Mrs. Elsner's voice echoed in her mind. "Curiosity is a disease here. It rots the mind." Clara crawled to the corner, pulling her sister's journal from under her apron. She opened it, her fingers smearing dirt across the pages. She searched for something, a word, a line, any anchor to hold her steady. But the words swam before her eyes. She pressed her forehead to the open page, her tears seeping into the paper. In that dark hush, Clara realized the threat was no longer just Mrs. Elsner's commands or the locked gates. It was the house itself, its walls, its silent halls, its cold, hungry rooms. The villa did not simply confine her, it intended to consume her. And with that final, shivering thought, something deep inside her spine hardened. That night, the villa felt more alive than ever. The walls seemed to shift with each breath Clara took, the floors humming faintly beneath her bare feet as she paced her small room. The storm outside gathered in slow, heavy waves, pressing fog against the barred window like a hand trying to smother her. She had barely slept since finding the letter. Every creak in the hallway sent sharp shocks through her spine. She kept her sister's journal close, her thumb rubbing the edge of the cover until the skin split. Near midnight, the door swung open without warning. Mrs. Elsner stood in the threshold, her black gown blending into the shadows behind her. The silver raven head of her cane caught the faint lamplight, gleaming like a watchful eye. "Come," she ordered softly. The softness felt more dangerous than any shouted command. Clara rose slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. She pressed the journal under her arm, but Mrs. Elsner's gaze dropped to it immediately. "Leave it," she whispered. Clara hesitated. But something in Mrs. Elsner's eyes, that cold, glimmering satisfaction, pinned her in place. With numb fingers, she set the journal down on the bed and stepped forward. Mrs. Elsner turned sharply and began moving down the corridor. Clara followed, her breath catching at every corner. They passed the dark library, the silent portraits, the kitchen door hanging slightly ajar. Finally, they stopped at the tower door. The heavy iron lock had been removed. The door yawned open into a spiraling staircase that curved up into blackness. Mrs. Elsner gestured with her cane. Inside, Clara's lips parted in a soundless plea, but her feet moved on their own. She stepped into the narrow stairwell, the air instantly colder, carrying the faint scent of wet stone and something sour, old sweat or tears. Mrs. Elsner followed, shutting the door behind them. The click of the lock echoed like a rifle crack in the confined space. They climbed in silence. At the top, a small landing opened into a bare chamber. One narrow window let in a thin stripe of moonlight, slicing across the floor like a blade. In the far corner, a small wooden stool sat beneath a dangling chain fixed to the wall. The chain ended in a thin iron cuff. Mrs. Elsner raised her cane and pointed. "Sit!" Clara backed away, shaking her head. Her back hit the cold wall. Mrs. Elsner stepped forward, her gloved hand striking Clara's cheek with surprising force. Clara's head snapped to the side. Stars burst behind her eyes. She staggered, her knees buckling. Before she could recover, Mrs. Elsner grabbed her by the arm and dragged her to the stool. The cane clattered to the floor. Mrs. Elsner clamped the cuff around Clara's wrist, tightening it until the iron bit into her skin. Then she stepped back, her breath smooth and steady, as though she had merely adjusted a vase on a shelf. "You will remain here until sunrise," she murmured, her voice slipping between the stones. "Silence will cleanse you. Resistance will starve you." Clara struggled weakly, the cuff rattling. Her voice came out in a broken whisper. "Please, don't." Mrs. Elsner tilted her head slightly as if considering her words. Then she smiled, a slow, thin curve of her lips that never reached her eyes. She turned and left without another word. The door shut behind her with a gentle click that landed in Clara's chest like a hammer blow. Darkness swallowed the room. The moonbeam shifted slowly as the night crawled forward. Clara pressed her forehead to the damp wall, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. The iron cuff cut deeper with each tremor of her body. In that suffocating hush, she heard them. Faint scratches above her, soft crying in the stones, echoes of those who had come before. A single thought blazed through the pain. She would not be next. The hours in the tower crawled by like insects, each second scratching at Clara's mind. Her head throbbed, her wrist throbbed even more sharply where the iron cuff bit into her skin. She shifted again and again, but every movement only made the shackle cut deeper. Outside, the moon moved slowly across the narrow window, its glow creeping across the stones like a watchful eye. Each faint groan of the house below, each rustle of the wind against the tower walls felt amplified in her skull. At some point, she didn't know if it was minutes or hours later, Clara's fingers brushed something on the wall behind her. The stone felt uneven beneath her touch. She turned her head, squinting into the darkness. She twisted as far as the cuff allowed and ran her fingertips along the crack. With trembling determination, she pushed at the loose section. A thin slab shifted slightly. revealing a narrow gap just wide enough to slip her hand into. Her fingers closed around something thin and rough. She tugged, her pulse hammering. Finally, she pulled out a small bundle of folded papers, their edges brittle and stained. She forced them open with shaking hands. The moonlight was faint, but she could just make out the jagged, frantic handwriting. I begged her to let me go. She said the tower would purify my defiance. Each night I hear them, scratching above, whispering my name. We are not companions here. We are offerings. Clara swallowed, bile rising in her throat. She flipped to another page. She calls it cleansing. She takes the voice first, then the mind. Those who survive become her shadows. Silent, empty. If you find this, please remember my name, Elise. The name hit Clara like a slap. Elise, a name she had heard in her sister's journal, scribbled once at the margin of a page. Elise was right. Clara's tears blurred the letters, her fingers clutching the paper so tightly they tore. She pressed the scraps to her chest, rocking slightly on the hard stool. Above her she heard the faintest echo, a scraping so gentle it might have been a breath, then a soft, almost human sob. The voices of the lost, the echoes of those who had sat where she now sat, bound and stripped of everything until only silence remained. She felt a tremor of something new cut through her horror. Fury, a heat that burned through her exhaustion and fear like a blade. She tucked the papers into her dress, pressing them flat against her skin. Each line felt like a shard of truth, each word a final cry from those who had been erased. She closed her eyes and pressed her forehead to the wall. One single vow formed in the pit of her chest, rising with each labored breath. I will not become her offering. I will not vanish into her silence. When the first gray line of dawn slipped through the narrow window, Clara's eyes opened. They were no longer empty with terror. They were sharp, alive, and burning. When the tower door finally creaked open, Clara did not move. Her body felt cold and brittle, but her mind burned with a new, searing clarity. Mrs. Elsner stepped into the room, her black gown trailing behind her like a dark wave. For a long moment she stood there in the pale morning light, her eyes resting on Clara's bowed head. Then, with slow precision, she unlocked the iron cuff and let it fall. The metal clanged against the stones, echoing sharply. "Stand," Mrs. Elsner commanded softly. Clara pushed herself up, her legs shaking beneath her. She kept her head lowered, hiding the smoldering heat behind her eyes. Mrs. Elsner watched her closely, her pale eyes flicking across Clara's face, her shoulders, her hands, as though searching for a crack, a hint of rebellion. "Today you will return to your duties," she said, stepping closer. Her voice was low and almost kind, which made it all the more terrifying. "But you will remember this lesson." Clara nodded, her fingers brushing the hidden papers beneath her dress. The thin crumple of them against her ribs felt like a pulse, a secret heartbeat that carried all the voices of the lost. Mrs. Elsner lifted a gloved hand and smoothed Clara's hair back, her touch so gentle it made Clara flinch. "You look tired," she whispered, her breath cold on Clara's cheek. "Perhaps you have finally learned humility." Clara did not respond. She forced her face to remain slack and empty, but inside every word cut deeper into her resolve, sharpening it like a blade. Downstairs, the housekeeper avoided her completely. She moved about the kitchen in quick, darting motions, her eyes fixed on the floor. Clara saw the tremor in her hands, the way her shoulders hunched whenever she heard Mrs. Elsner's steps echo through the halls. Later, while carrying a tray to the library, Clara passed the groundskeeper in the corridor. Their eyes met for just an instant. His gaze fell to her hands, then darted up again to her face. His lips parted slightly, as though he wanted to speak, to warn her, but he snapped them shut and looked away. A shiver ran down Clara's spine. She felt the walls lean closer, felt the air itself tighten around her throat. When she reached the library, Mrs. Elsner sat waiting by the window, her cane across her lap. Clara lowered the tray slowly, careful not to let her hands shake. Mrs. Elsner's eyes followed her every motion. She tilted her head slightly, studying Clara as though she were a cracked porcelain doll. "You are quieter today," Mrs. Elsner said at last. "I see something has shifted in you." Clara kept her gaze down. Her voice, when it finally emerged, sounded far away and small. "Yes, madam," Mrs. Elsner's lips curved in a thin, satisfied smile. Good. A long silence stretched between them. Clara's heart hammered against the papers hidden under her dress, each beat a warning, a promise. When Mrs. Elsner finally looked away, turning her gaze out the window toward the rolling fog, Clara allowed her shoulders to sag slightly, not from submission, but from the effort of holding in her rage. She knew Mrs. Elsner suspected something. She could feel it in the way the woman's gaze burned across her skin, as if she could peel her open and read the secrets written inside. But for now, Clara forced herself to remain small and silent. She would wait and watch and plan. Because she was no longer a companion waiting to be broken. She was a blade waiting to be drawn. That night, Clara sat hunched on her narrow bed, her bandaged hands trembling as they turned each fragile page of her sister's journal. The hidden letters from the tower lay folded beneath her pillow, a quiet, urgent weight. The moon crawled slowly across the barred window, smearing pale light across the floor. Each distant creak of the house set her teeth on edge. She imagined Mrs. Elsner drifting through the halls like a wraith, listening for any crack in her resolve. She was about to hide the journal again when a faint tap sounded at her door. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. Another tap, softer than a whisper. Slowly she crept forward and eased the door open just a sliver. In the dim hallway stood the housekeeper, her eyes wide and glassy, her shoulders quivering as though she might collapse at any moment. Clara's mouth opened, but no sound came. The housekeeper lifted a trembling finger to her lips. Silence. Then, from the folds of her apron, she drew out a small, tarnished key. Their eyes met, and in that glance Clara saw the full depth of the woman's terror. But beyond it something else flickered, a fragile, desperate hope. The housekeeper pressed the key into Clara's hand, closing her cold fingers around it. She leaned close, her cracked lips brushing Clara's ear. "Under the terrace," she breathed so faintly it felt like a dream. "Stone hatch, use the storm." Clara's eyes burned with sudden tears. She gripped the woman's wrist, but the housekeeper pulled back quickly, her gaze darting down the hallway. They stood frozen for one last heartbeat, the unspoken understanding burning between them. Then the housekeeper slipped away into the shadows, her footsteps light as drifting ash. Clara shut the door softly and stumbled back to her bed. She fell to her knees, clutching the key to her chest so tightly it cut into her skin. She pressed her forehead to the wooden frame of her bed, her breath coming in short, shaking bursts. The storm, she would wait for it, cover her escape in its roar and chaos. The housekeeper's terrified face stayed with her, a final human echo in the depths of this silent, devouring house. For the first time, Clara felt a sliver of something sharp and bright push through the darkness. She was not entirely alone. Someone had chosen to risk everything for her. She opened her sister's journal and carefully slid the key into the spine, hiding it beneath the fragile pages. Then she pressed the journal to her chest and squeezed her eyes shut, feeling the hot salt of her tears seep into the paper. Tomorrow would come with its own horrors, but tonight there was a plan, a chance. A pulse of life still beat inside her, and now it had a direction. The next day dragged like a blade against Clara's skin. Every chore, every forced interaction felt stretched and brittle, as though the house itself sensed what she carried inside her dress. The key, hidden in her sister's journal, weighed on her like a second heartbeat. She moved carefully, her gaze lowered, her shoulders bent, every step a silent rehearsal for her escape. That morning, Mrs. Elsner watched her with unsettling intensity from the library armchair. Clara read aloud in a flat, measured voice, the words from the old text sliding past her lips like water over stones. Mrs. Elsner's pale eyes tracked her every blink, her fingers drumming softly on the raven-headed cane. At one point, Mrs. Elsner leaned forward. "You seem distant today," she murmured. Clara swallowed hard, her hands tightening on the book. "I'm only tired, madam." A long pause. Then Mrs. Elsner leaned back again, her lips curling faintly. "Good," she said. A tired mind has fewer questions. When she was finally dismissed, Clara slipped back to her small room and shut the door. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she sank to the floor, pressing her forehead to the cool boards. She pulled out the journal and opened the spine, touching the hidden key with shaking fingers. The metal felt cold, Real. The first real thing in this house of fog and lies. She repeated the plan to herself in a whisper. Under the terrace, stone hatch, use the storm. As dusk fell, thunder began to rumble beyond the forest ridge. The sky turned the color of bruised flesh, heavy clouds writhing above the pines. Rain tapped at the windows in uneven rhythms, like hurried fingers at a locked door. Clara moved through her final evening tasks in a fog. She scrubbed the steps, collected linens, folded them with meticulous care, a last attempt to leave no trace of the defiance burning inside her. She avoided the eyes of the housekeeper and the groundskeeper, afraid a single glance might unravel everything. But once, in the kitchen doorway, she caught the housekeeper's gaze. The older woman gave the tiniest nod, her lips pressed into a thin, shaking line. By the time the dinner bell echoed through the halls, lightning flashed across the mountains, illuminating the villa's dark silhouette in pale, jagged glimpses. Clara returned to her room and closed the door. She tore off the bandages around her fingers and dressed quickly, wrapping the journal tightly against her body with a length of cloth. She took the key and held it to her lips, breathing against the cold iron. Her eyes drifted to the barred window. Beyond it, the storm had arrived in full force, shaking the pines and ripping at the ivy along the walls. She pressed her forehead to the glass, feeling each raindrop strike like a drumbeat. Tonight she would run. She would leave behind the watchful portraits, the endless halls, and the tower that devoured the living. She touched the journal one last time. For her sister, for Elise, for the voices she had heard in the stone. When the thunder crashed directly overhead, rattling the window panes, Clara turned from the glass, slipped the key into her apron pocket, and exhaled slowly. The house waited. The storm howled, and inside her chest her heart finally rose like a blade. Clara slipped out of her room as the storm raged above, each thunderclap masking the creak of the floorboards beneath her bare feet. She pressed the key deep into her pocket, her hand closing around it so tightly that the iron cut into her palm. Lightning split the sky beyond the tall windows, turning the corridors into brief, violent flashes of silver and shadow. She kept to the walls, her breath shallow, her ears straining for any echo of the cane. At the end of the main hallway, she found the small stone passage that led to the terrace steps. Her heart hammered so loud she feared it might call Mrs. Elsner from the darkness. She reached the terrace door. The key slid into the old lock with a soft, grinding protest. Clara's entire body shook as she turned it. Another deafening crack of thunder, then the lock gave way. She pushed the heavy door open just wide enough to slip through. The wind slammed into her, flinging her hair across her face and soaking her dress instantly. The storm roared around her, almost alive in its fury. She stumbled across the marble terrace, searching frantically. Her hands swept over the slick stones until she felt it, a thin seam outlining a hidden hatch, just as the housekeeper had said. She knelt and began prying at it, her fingernails breaking on the rough edges. Tears and rain blurred her vision. Behind her, a sudden noise rose above the storm, the sharp, deliberate tap of a cane on stone. Clara froze. She turned, her breath caught in her throat. Mrs. Elsner stood beneath the terrace arch, her gown whipping in the wind like a tattered sail. Her hair had come loose in thin gray strands that lashed against her face, but her eyes glowed with a terrible, unwavering focus. "You thought you could leave?" Mrs. Elsner's voice carried above the rain, smooth and cold. "You thought you were stronger than them?" Clara pushed again at the hatch, but her wet fingers slipped uselessly. Mrs. Elsner moved forward, her cane scraping across the terrace, each step steady despite the chaos around her. "Look at you," she hissed, her voice tightening into a snarl. "Filthy, trembling, small, just like the rest. I offered you a place, a purpose, and you choose to crawl away like a rat." Clara lurched to her feet, her back pressed against the hatch, her hand fumbled inside her pocket, finding the cold iron of the key. Mrs. Elsner lunged. Clara ducked sideways, the cane whistling past her ear and smashing into the stones with a sharp crack. Clara shoved forward, slamming her shoulder into Mrs. Elsner's chest. The older woman staggered back, her cane clattering across the terrace and disappearing into the storm. Clara's fingers found the hatch seam again, yanking with all her strength. At last it gave a small, sudden shriek of hinges as the stone door lifted. Mrs. Elsner screamed and lunged again, her hands clawing for Clara's throat. Clara swung her elbow wildly, striking her across the jaw. The impact sent Mrs. Elsner sprawling to the ground, her mouth twisting into a silent snarl of rage. With one final surge, Clara shoved the hatch open wide enough to slip through. She plunged into the dark, rain-soaked tunnel below, her feet skidding on the slick steps. Above her, Mrs. Elsner's scream rose, long, raw, almost animal, and then was swallowed by a thunderclap. Clara didn't look back. She scrambled down into the cold blackness, the journal clutched to her chest like a shield. The villa above howled in the storm, the walls echoing with the last furious curses of the woman she had left behind. But Clara's mind held only one thought, burning through the pain and terror. I am still alive. The tunnel twisted and dropped beneath the villa like an old root clawing into the earth. Clara ran blindly, her fingers scraping along the wet stone walls for balance. The storm's distant roar echoed above, muffled now, like the growl of some dying animal. Her lungs burned with each breath, sharp and raw. Her dress clung to her legs, heavy with rain and mud, pulling at her with every frantic step. The journal pressed against her chest felt almost too heavy to carry, but she held it tighter, as though it were her last remaining limb. At every turn, she half expected to hear Mrs. Elsner's cane striking the stones behind her, that cold voice calling her name. But only her own panicked footfalls and ragged breaths filled the darkness. She stumbled down a final, sharp decline, crashing to her knees in a shallow pool of freezing water. For a moment she curled in on herself, her forehead pressed to the wet earth, her body shaking from exhaustion and terror. A thin draft moved past her face, cold and sharp. She forced her head up and saw a narrow opening ahead, a jagged tear in the stone wall, just wide enough to squeeze through. With shaking arms she crawled forward. Her shoulders scraped against the rock and she had to push the journal ahead of her like a fragile creature. When she finally broke through, she tumbled out onto a steep, rain-slick slope. The cold mountain air hit her face, sharp and clean. She gasped, gulping it in as though she had been drowning. Above her, the dark outline of the villa loomed against the storm-bruised sky, its tower barely visible through the sheets of rain. Even from this distance, she imagined she could feel its gaze, the weight of its hunger, the echo of its locked doors. Clara scrambled to her feet, her legs weak and uncertain beneath her. She pressed the journal to her chest, its damp cover warm from her body. She turned away from the villa and staggered down the slope. Rocks tore at her bare feet and branches whipped at her arms and face, but she didn't stop. The storm howled around her, the wind shoving her forward as if urging her to flee faster. In the occasional lightning flashes, she glimpsed the winding path below, a thin trail cutting into the forest, vanishing into the mist. She followed it, half running, half falling. Each step away from the villa felt like breaking a chain, tearing free from a prison she hadn't fully understood until she felt the night air in her lungs. At one point, she tripped and fell hard, sliding down a patch of slick mud. She lay there for a moment, her breath shuddering, her entire body aching. Then, slowly, she rolled onto her back and looked up. The rain fell in heavy, cold sheets, blurring the trees above into dark smears. The night sky beyond glowed faintly at the edges, as if promising a dawn she could barely imagine. Clara pulled herself to her knees and pressed her forehead to the journal. Her lips moved in a silent prayer, not for safety, not for forgiveness, but for strength to keep moving, no matter what lay ahead. She rose again, her fingers clawing at the wet earth for balance, and stumbled forward into the forest. Behind her, the mountain roared in the storm, but she did not turn back. Clara was no longer a companion, no longer an offering. She was a spark in the dark, and tonight she had chosen her own fire. By dawn, the storm had finally begun to break, leaving the mountain shrouded in a thin, trembling mist. Pale light spread slowly across the forest, touching the soaked leaves and slick stones with a quiet, hesitant glow. Clara staggered along a narrow trail that curved away from the slope. Her entire body throbbed with pain, every muscle burned, every breath dragged through her chest like a knife. She paused beside a twisted pine, gripping its rough trunk to steady herself. The journal pressed against her ribs felt heavier than ever, but she would not let it go. It was her sister's last gift, her last map out of that devouring house. She pressed her forehead to the bark, her tears mixing with the rainwater still dripping from her hair. In that moment, her mind played the echoes of the villa, Mrs. Elsner's humming in the halls, the hollow scrape of the tower door, the desperate letter hidden in the linen closet. Clara's fingers curled tighter around the journal. She turned her face upward toward the pale sky slowly brightening above the black treetops. A single sob burst from her, sharp and sudden, but this time it wasn't only terror. It was a cry of release, the raw sound of a bird breaking through a snare. She pushed off the tree and limped forward, step by slow step. The trail wound lower, opening into a narrow valley where morning fog curled along the ground like cautious fingers. Far ahead, she could see the faint suggestion of a road, and perhaps beyond that, the first signs of a village. Thin gray smoke rising in fragile columns. Each movement forward felt like shattering glass. Her feet slipped on roots and rocks, her wounds screamed at her to stop, but she kept moving, her eyes locked on that distant line of smoke. When she finally reached a small rise at the edge of the valley, Clara turned. The mountain loomed behind her, its slopes wrapped in drifting fog. The villa was hidden now, swallowed by the trees and clouds, like a terrible dream slipping beneath the surface of waking thought. She pressed her hand to the journal one last time, feeling its worn edges, the soaked cover, the ghost of her sister's hand in every page. With the other hand she wiped her tears, smearing mud and blood across her face. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but in her chest something steadier had begun to pulse, a quiet, stubborn flame. She took a single shaking breath and stepped forward down the slope, away from the mountain's shadow. The valley opened to her like a deep, tentative breath. Each step no longer felt like flight, but like the slow reclaiming of her own body, her own voice. Clara did not know who she would be beyond this forest, what shape her wounds would take, or whether safety truly waited in that distant village. But each footfall carried one simple, defiant truth. She had chosen, not the house, not Mrs. Elsner, not the shadows in the tower, her. And with that, Clara stepped into the fragile morning light, no longer a prisoner, no longer an echo, but a living, breathing flame.